Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, budgets are important. Budgets are an opportunity. And despite an increasing ambivalence towards budgets by the media, by the general public, they'd rather perhaps see the outcome of the state of origin, understandably. They might like to see something else. Budgets remain fundamental to the business of this place. Budgets remain fundamental to the business of this state. And indeed, the whole reason we have parliaments is to scrutinise the expenditure by government. That was the reason they came about. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have to say I had hoped that the new Treasurer of this government would bring some understanding, some life and some passion back to this most important aspect of government. The setting out of a government's economic and fiscal plan for the next 12 months at the very least, and for the term of this government, given that it is just the beginning of a 2-year and 10-month term. Sadly, I was disappointed. I suppose I wasn't as disappointed as the previous Treasurer, who might have felt somewhat aggrieved. His hard work, and it is hard work preparing budgets, his hard work wasn't even recognised. Not one word, not a mention. I thought in 2017 the lack of mention by everyone else apart from the then Treasurer of his budget was something bad. But this time we've seen it carried on to a higher level. The member for South Brisbane, the Treasurer, did not even do the former Treasurer, the now Speaker, the member for Mulgrave, the courtesy of acknowledging the work that he put in the last 3 years, even though all of those budgets were dismal failures. He did not even do them the courtesy of recognising it. Not a word of thanks for his efforts. And now, this fourth Palaszczuk Labor budget. I'm disappointed that it is the fourth Labor budget. I had hoped it would be different, but that is not to be, and that is the way our system operates. But this fourth budget, brought down by the member for South Brisbane, has again been described, and we've heard this ad nauseam, as a typical Labor budget. Well, Madam Speaker, how many times have I heard that phrase used to describe a lacklustre document that has no plan, no idea and no hope for a secure economic future? This was such a typical Labor budget. This was such a typical Labor budget that even the Treasurer could only devote just over 20 minutes to extolling its virtues. 20 minutes. Just over 20 minutes. That's how typical this Labor budget was. Madam Deputy Speaker, what could we expect? We read stories about the member for South Brisbane, about her passion, how she was a dedicated social activist. She was going to bring it to the Treasury portfolio. We were expecting more vim, more vigour, more enthusiasm. But what did we see? Nada. Blah, bland, nothing. And what did we hear? Or more importantly, what didn't we hear? What didn't we hear? We didn't hear coal. No, we never heard anything about coal.
What's that?
We didn't hear about mining. We didn't hear about debt. We didn't hear about a fiscal balance. We didn't hear about taxes. We didn't hear about broken promises. And we certainly didn't hear any new ideas. No new ideas. Now, Speaker, it's been my great misfortune to have to endure too many Labor budgets, I'm sad to say. And last Tuesday, I heard it all again. I heard it all again, and I was reminded of the failure of the Labor Treasurer's hero and idol, Anna Bligh. Now, others may wish to forget, but I remember that government, and I remember its budgets, and I remember the member for Inala, and I remember the member for Inala, and I remember the member for Inala, I remember the member for Woodridge, I remember the member for Cooper, and the member for Sandgate and the member for McAllister were all a part of that government that rightfully got turfed out in 2012. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I remember the member for Miller. I remember him when he was part of a Labor council that got turfed out in 2004 as well. 2004. A man so game he didn't even want to go back. He took 8 years off. Went to find himself. I remember them all.
Order. Can I just return you to the long title of the bill, please?
Discovering himself.
Madam Deputy Speaker.
Order.
Others, as I say, may wish to forget, but I remember. But I remember that government. I remember what they had done. And they had gone bust in a boom. They had frittered away the best terms of trade that this nation had seen at a time when our resources couldn't be pulled out of the ground fast enough, at a time when the price we were getting for those resources could not have been higher, more than $300 a tonne for coal. What did that government do? They went bust in a boom. They spent it all. They spent it all. They lost. They lost Queensland's prized AAA credit rating. They started borrowing at unsustainable rates. Let me be a little more clear as I quote from a very good budget speech from someone who had a bit more vim and vigour in those days, from 2012. What had happened? Fixing our finances. Labor had a fire sale of assets, abolished the fuel subsidy, remember that?
Point of order,
and made buying the family home up to $7,000 more expensive.
Order, member. What is your order?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as fascinating as 2012 is and the member's speaking notes from the time, this is the 2018 budget. Can I ask him to come back to the budget that's actually before the House?
Thank you, member. I ask the member to return to the bill.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am discussing the budget. I'm discussing the economic plan. And as the member for Woodridge, the member for Cooper, I think even the member for Stretton have all spoken about past budgets and about past activities of the LNP government, I would think that this is exactly on point. Exactly on point. Made buying the family home up to $7,000 more expensive. Remember, they abolished the stamp duty concession on buying the family home, $7,000, increased tolls by 30% on all of the motorways through Queensland, 30% increase in tolls, and also made Queensland the most expensive state in Australia to register and run a motor vehicle. And what were we told when we came to government? Because this has been raised. And this is what the Queensland Treasury government brief said. There are those who might remember. Queensland's fiscal position and outlook is unsustainable and restoration must be an urgent priority for this term of government. And what did the Queensland Treasury Corporation say? They said the state's debt has reached unprecedented levels. Together with its published forward estimates showing an even greater volume of debt required, Queensland is now in uncharted waters with respect to the volume of debt on issue and the resultant interest bill. We had the Commission of Audit, and the government's very keen to point out that it was headed up by Peter Costello, as it was, but they seem to skip over the fact that it was also headed up by Dr Doug McTaggart, the head of the Queensland Investment Corporation, under Labor, and Professor Sandra Harding, the Chancellor of James Cook University. It wasn't a one-man show, it was all three of them. And they conveniently forget that. But they said the magnitude of the task is substantially larger than previously recognised because the former government has built in unrealistically optimistic budget assumptions that have masked the magnitude of the underlying structural problems. But, Madam Speaker, what else happened? Who else said something about it? Well, here's one that I managed to dig up about what we faced after coming to government. For Labor ex-minister, a time of atonement. Tony Moore, 30th of July 2012. And what does this luminary say? Here's the quote from it. As we worked through the interview He described how he felt the party should have concentrated more on the economy during the election campaign, emphasising the decisions it had made. This is the quote: "I do think Labor fell into the error or seriously miscalculated and underestimated the desire for Queenslanders to hold on to the AAA credit rating," he said. "And I think the concern Queenslanders are generally about government, debt and deficit, and I think we were unable effectively to tell our story." Who was the luminary who did that? And it's interesting, when you read prior to those quotes, Tony Moore had rung a few people, and most felt it was not yet time to speak publicly. But not this one. Not this former Labor luminary. Who was it? The member for Woodridge. What a surprise! What a surprise. The member for Woodridge. Never short of a word is the member for Woodridge. We remember him well. Now, what are we seeing in this latest incarnation of a budget? Madam Speaker, we're seeing the complete abrogation of responsibility by an innumerate Premier and an economically reckless Treasurer. We're seeing 5 new taxes. 4 slipped in under the cover of an advertising blackout in the last election, and a new waste tax justified under many guises and excuses, but we all know is simply because Labor can't manage its finances. Expenses grow exponentially, and this government ignores its own fiscal principles. And what's the result? Debt and deficit. And what's so important about fiscal deficits? They mean more debt. And more debt, Madam Speaker, is just a tax on future generations. It has to be paid. There is no other way. It has to be paid. Now, the Leader of the Opposition has clearly outlined a plan for a better Queensland under an LNP government, a clear plan with clear priorities and clear commitments. And the Shadow Treasurer has outlined the failings of this budget. And while that's not as difficult a task as it might otherwise be, I comprehensively applaud both of them for their work and their speeches and their outlining of the issues here this morning. Now, we'll hear much from those opposite that we on this side will complain that not enough is being spent on projects, while not saying where the money will come from and opposing tax grabs in the budget. They will say that. They always do. Well, let me say this. They're not mutually dependent. Better spending the funds that are already granted us by the taxpayers can still deliver the services and infrastructure this great state needs. It's hard work. It requires a lot of hard work. It requires discipline. But it can be done. It just can't be done by Labor. It just can't be done by Labor. Not with a government enthralled to the union movement, with ministers who have inappropriate back-channel communications, who can't or won't act in the best interests of Queenslanders, but rather in the interests of their union mates. Fundamentally, Madam Speaker, this budget highlights in the starkest terms the fundamental difference between our side of the House and those opposite. They think they can tax and borrow the state to financial prosperity, save families money and deliver services. We know you can't. We know it's individuals, freed of the shackles of the state, who receive reward for effort, who aren't taxed every time they are successful, who aren't subject to the politics of envy, who will truly drive growth, jobs and prosperity for the future. Madam Speaker, in the short time left, I want to deal with a couple more issues. One not dealt with in this budget, and it's to do with the parity of pay for frontline therapy staff. This would have been the appropriate time to deal with that. I declare my interest. My wife's an occupational therapist. She works in Ed, Queensland, has done for 25 years with disabled children. A great group of people who work with those kids in our state education system. I've seen what they do. And there is a significant pay disparity between OTs employed in Education Queensland and those employed by the Department of Health. And it amounts in years 8 for a therapist, a qualified therapist, not just OTs but physios and speechies and others, to almost $20,000 worth of difference between someone employed in the Education Department and someone employed in the Health Department doing exactly the same job with exactly the same qualifications. This has been raised with the Minister, who has done nothing about it, and this budget would have been the ideal time to do it. In Clayfield, Madam Deputy Speaker, the issue in relation to spending is quite stark. There is a more than 25% decrease in spending for Brisbane North compared to the last LNP government. In my own electorate, the schools continue to receive the rough end of the pineapple from this government. In fact, no funding for the Kedron State School Performance Hall, which is a sorely needed requirement for a school with almost 1,600 students. We've seen a miserly amount of funds for some school classrooms and a pool upgrade. The Kedron State High School Performing Arts Centre is the #1 priority for that school and the #1 priority. In fact, the only thing in relation to education that Labor has done in my electorate is close the Pinkenbar State School. That's the only thing they've done. That's the only thing they've managed to do. Traffic congestion remains. Madam Speaker, this budget disappoints in all critical respects. In all critical respects. It was an opportunity for the new Treasurer to set out a pathway forward. It was an opportunity to show what this government plans for the future of this great state. It is my misfortune to see yet another typical lazy Labor budget.